Hello and welcome into episode 19 of Preps to Pros. I'm Cooper Petagna with Andrew Ivins. We got a great show for you today as we wrap up week 3 of the college football season. A lot going on. Bryan Harsin fighting for his job in the Plains after an embarrassing 41-12 loss to Penn State this weekend. We'll recap that. We'll talk a little bit about the recruiting fallout there. We'll also talk about Alabama getting a top 247 commitment from Jordan Renaud out of the state of Texas this morning. We'll talk about the Arch Manning official visit. The Athletic came out with an article recently. We'll recap that $280,000, the tab run up by Texas and that staff. We'll also get to Arizona State. Who is our first call going to be? We'll get into the 2-minute drill, talk a little bit about Amon-Ra St. Brown, and then Kansas and Duke, two basketball schools, both at 3-0 right now. One of them going to be 4-0 after next week's matchup. But Drew, the Oyster Boyz were in Alabama this week in my neck of the woods, my man. You were at the Auburn Penn State game. We'll get to that later, but what was it like being in the state of Alabama?
Oh, man, it was fun. I was, as a civilian, I was a guest, went out to a farm, a plantation. Then I hit the game, tailgated, and just got to experience a bucket list stadium, Jordan Hare. And I know you saw Bryan Harsin on Friday night. I saw his team on Saturday. So, perfect kind of time to talk about the Tigers. I know we're going to get into that. And then you mentioned Duke on the back end. I feel like we talk about Duke more than any other team on this show.
Mike Elko and the boys getting it done, man. But yeah, let's start state of Alabama. We'll get to Auburn here in a second. But Alabama, listen, I know how methodical they are on the recruiting trail, but we got to talk about this. I think everybody just says, oh, this is Nick Saban. This is what they do. They reload, but they grab a commitment from top 247 defensive lineman Jordan Renaud, a guy that you and I, Andrew, got to see in Bradenton at the Future 50, impressed us there. I think he was a little bit more athletic and a guy that had a little bit more meat on the bone in terms of the projection to the next level than what we thought. But they go head-to-head with Oklahoma. They get him out of the state of Texas. He will join top 247 defensive lineman Hunter Osborne, also with edge rusher Yanze Pierre. They have Edric Hill, another 4-star from the state of Missouri, in that class. And Drew, they got some other guys on the board from your neck of the woods, Keon Keeley, Damon Wilson, and then a couple guys from the state of Alabama, Jaquavius Rousseau and James Smith, they're still working on. So this is looking like a monumental front seven class potentially for Alabama. But I want to get your thoughts on Jordan Renaud.
Well, let's talk about that defensive line class. It's like Nick Saban saw what Jimbo Fisher did last year. Hey, I'm going to one-up you right here with what we're going to get committed in 2023. Jordan Renaud, he's a kid I saw at the Future 50 back in June. Remember, we were talking to him in the lobby of that hotel, and I brought up to him, hey, Jordan, he was a kid that's originally from Florida. I remember seeing him 2 years ago at Traz-Powell Stadium when he was at Palmetto playing against Miami Central, obviously one of the more storied programs in the Sunshine State. Jordan Renaud was just a sophomore at the time, long and lean. He had 11 tackles and a sack that night. I think it was 6 tackles for loss. And I remember thinking to myself, hey, this guy's going to be a dude. Well, he leaves my region, moves out to Texas, so I don't see him for a while. And then at Future 50, I had to keep checking the roster. I'm like, is this the same kid? Because he had developed into a monster up front. And it's funny, I had a college staffer text me this morning. Hey, is Jordan Renaud, are they taking him as an interior guy or an exterior guy? Because I think they're hoping that maybe some of those other defensive linemen, Cooper, you mentioned, will fall to them now that they got Jordan in the boat. But it sounds like they kind of see him in that 4-eye inside role. And I think he's going to be a monster there up front. We loved him at the Future 50. I mean, do you have a player comp for him? Because I know Gabe Brooks, our colleague, tossed one out in the group chat, and I loved it.
Yeah, I haven't seen that one yet, but that was a good question. We were kind of talking about it this morning. Director of Recruiting Steve Wolfong and I talking about whether or not this guy's going to play standing up in a 2-point stance. Is he going to play in a 3-point stance? Alabama, I believe, has told Jordan Renaud that he's going to play as a defensive lineman. To me, he's 240 pounds. He's got a 6'7+ wingspan, but this typically looks like a guy that could play in a 3-4 in a stand-up position, outside linebacker role for Alabama. So we'll see. He's got a lot of room to grow. Wouldn't be surprised if he puts on 25+ pounds at the next level, but I love his versatility. 6'3.5", 240, like I said. He can play the 4-eye, he can play the 3 technique, and he is very powerful. Going back, looking at some of those one-on-one reps in Bradenton, you look at him and the way that he moves, his lateral quickness and his change of direction, but he has heavy hands, very powerful at the point of attack, and he moved people, whether that was Amir Herring committed to Michigan or whether that was Caden Green committed to Oklahoma. His presence was felt at the Future 50, and certainly a guy that fits the mold of what Alabama wants to do. But Drew, I mean, two other guys, and I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about these guys, but Keon Keeley and Damon Wilson. I mean, if you throw either one of those guys in this class, I mean, that is lethal for Alabama.
Yeah, and I think the two in-state kids, Quay Russaw and James Smith, I mean, they were at Auburn over the weekend. We're going to get into the Tigers. We keep saying that, but I think Alabama's probably in pole position there. I still like the Crimson Tide for Keon Keeley. I know 24/7 Sports Director of Recruiting Steve Wiltfong reported this morning that Keeley's probably going to get back to Ohio State for an unofficial visit after taking that official visit over Labor Day weekend. I've heard the same. So I think Ohio State maybe has shrunk that gap between them and Alabama, but I still like the Crimson Tide for Keon Keeley. We'll see with Damon Wilson, but I'll say this, Cooper, you're forgetting one other pass rusher. What about Ruben Bain from Miami Central, the school I just talked about? He had 29 sacks last season, had 3 sacks against IMG Academy in the upset for the Rockets. I think if there's one school that will be able to pull him out of the 305, and I've said this before on this show, it's Alabama. He's got a ton of ties to the Hurricanes, but down here, one school that you can go to and no one's going to question you leaving is the Crimson Tide. So overall, I just think Alabama's defensive class, we always talk about Georgia's defensive class, but Alabama's class, man, they got Caleb Downs, Tony Mitchell, Jaleel Hurley, and then this elite group of defensive linemen. It's going to be pretty hard to score points on them at some point over the next few years.
Alabama getting it done on the defensive end, and that class can only get stronger. So before we transition to Texas, talk a little bit about Arch Manning's official visit. That's been very newsworthy as of late. Make sure you subscribe to the 24/7 Sports YouTube channel. Make sure you keep our lights on for Andrew and I. We appreciate you guys tuning in. But Drew, let's get to that. This is something you wanted to talk about. Our guy, Sam Kahn at The Athletic, did a very in-depth piece on everything that went in to Texas's official visit when they hosted Arch Manning, 8 other official visitors on that trip as well. And remember, with the NCAA, you can now have up to 4 family members paid for room and board during that 48-hour visit. So keep that in mind. But that tab runs up to $280,000. That's not just Arch Manning. That's 8 other families as well. But Drew, your initial thoughts on this, is this made up to be too big of a deal, or is this just what's expected of the price you have to pay to win at this level now?
Well, I think it's worth every penny. I mean, they're paying $250,000, and how much Arch Manning could potentially make the University of Texas over the next not only 4, 5, 6 years, but let's talk decades. And assuming he plays to the level we think he can play football at as a quarterback. No, this is worth it. Cooper, I wanted to ask you, man, you've been on the other side. You've organized some of these recruiting weekends. Like, this is just kind of par for the course. I think it is a little funny when you start getting into the breakdown when it goes meal by meal. I mean, a mimosa bar for breakfast for the parents is probably a little over the top, but I mean, you've orchestrated this. Your initial thoughts? I mean, you would say the same thing. This is doing business these days.
I made some calls to a couple of director of recruitings, former director of on-campus recruitings as well, and this is not something that would be considered atypical. I think, when we were at the University of Washington, especially in Seattle, I mean, comparable to Austin in the University of Texas, those are just part of, I guess, the realities of being in a city like Seattle or Austin. You're going to pay top dollar to put these recruits in their families in top of the line hotels. And really, when you kind of look at the itemized receipt from that weekend, you look at Texas, a lot of that bill was shelled out at the Four Seasons, a 5-star hotel right there in the heart of downtown Austin. So you take that into consideration. You talked about it. You're hitting on the mimosas, but a lot of this is kind of funded for the parents in that experience as well. You also have to take into consideration Texas's staff, the spouses of staff members as well, support staff members as well. It's a lot more than just 34 people that they have to take into consideration. So as of now, 4 of the 9 visitors on that visit of that June weekend committed to the Texas Longhorns. But I agree with you, Drew. This is the price of doing business. I remember when Kirby Smart got to the University of Georgia, there were a lot of questions on how much money Georgia was spending. I don't hear those questions now. Nobody questions the amount of money that Nick Saban spends on recruiting. You can make the argument that it's silly to the point that where we've gotten in college football, some of the things, the accessories that are available on these weekend trips, that's fine. I think there's a conversation there. But as of right now, This is the price of doing business. And you see Alabama, if they're the barometer, they're the standard in college football. Texas just lost a game to them by 1 point in a game they should have won. And right now, ranked number 1 in the recruiting rankings in 2023, Nick Saban and the Alabama Crimson's tied. Number 2, Steve Sarkisian and the Texas Longhorns. This is exactly what you need to do to win in this day of age. So I have no issue with this whatsoever. And it's a lot more than Arch Manning, the $280,000 bill that you see there, a lot more going into that. But I have no issue with Texas doing that. But Drew, let's kind of get to the elephant.
Cooper,
go ahead.
You mentioned Georgia. I actually looked it up before we started the show. Back in 2019, that the recruiting budget for travel, so we're talking travel, not even going out and hosting kids, which we know is expensive, $2.83 million. $2.8 million. That's what they paid in private jets, flying the coaches around. Do you think Georgia thinks that's worth it right now? 2 years later, you win a national title, a college football playoff. So I wouldn't be worried about the cost at all.
Takes what it takes, man. And that's especially in the SEC. Texas getting ready for the SEC as they will transition there, maybe as soon as next year, but 2024. So let's stay with the SEC and let's talk about Bryan Harsin, a guy that, right now seems to be the center of the conversation, these coaching cycle that we hear his name obviously on the hot seat. They take a thumping from Penn State as James Franklin and his crew and his core of freshman running backs come in and run all over Auburn 41-12. And Drew, I don't really want to get into the nitty gritty of this game. I just kind of want to ask you were a bystander there. You were at the game and their expectations at Auburn, especially when a team out of conference comes into town and beats you that way. It's very deflating, but I want to get your pulse on what you saw on Saturday, maybe from the surroundings after that game.
Yeah, so I went up there with a few friends. My buddy actually played at Auburn years ago, so I spent the weekend kind of hanging out with some alums, some former players, some boosters, some donors, and just I kept asking, what do you think about Bryan Harsin? What do you think about the direction of where Auburn's at right now? And there was not a lot of support for him before the game, and there certainly wasn't a lot of support after the game. I mean, in the third quarter, as soon as Auburn took that, built on their lead, we saw a lot of people go towards the exit. And in the fourth quarter, I mean, there was no one there. Everyone was watching the game from the outside. So I don't know. Auburn's in a funk. It seems like everyone thinks that Bryan Harsin is not a fit in Auburn, Alabama. Obviously, he came from Boise State in Idaho. Now he's dropped himself in the South. And it's not really working out. He has not made a lot of friends. I know the athletic director, the athletic department, the boosters haven't really given him, the keys to success. But at the same time, he seems to kind of be working against himself. And one fan brought up to me, they're like, "Hey, well, we got these 4-star guys committed," and I was quick to fire back. I think they've been picking kind of some low-hanging fruit here. You look at that recruiting class. I don't see any day 1 or day 2 difference makers, and then you take that and combine it to what we saw on Saturday on the field. Yeah, Robbie Ashford, Tank Bigsby. I mean, there was flashes of talent, but Auburn was just outplayed by Penn State, and I think it's going to be they need some influx of talent. That was crystal clear. Penn State just kind of did what they wanted to up front, which is a bit surprising. I mean, it wasn't too long ago Auburn was competing and playing for national titles, and I think what happened. Cooper, how long do you think Bryan Harsin has? I mean, can he dig himself out of this?
I don't think he has very long. Missouri's coming to town this weekend. That's 11 a.m. kick. I think everybody knew this was kind of the pendulum swing of the season. The season was going to take an expected step back, or it was going to take a jolt forward with a win against Penn State. That didn't happen, but you also lost in embarrassing fashion, 41-12. Like I mentioned, Auburn right now has the number 58 ranked recruiting class. That is 13th in the SEC. If you don't know how many teams are in the SEC, there's 14. So that's second to last. In terms of the talent acquisition, we just spent the last couple minutes talking about Texas, Steve Sarkisian, and the positive outlook on the Texas football program because of the way that they're recruiting. That is not getting done at Auburn. They have 9 commitments right now. 3 of those guys are in the top 247, and you're barely inside the top 60. And this was a staff that really kind of put all their eggs in one basket for this big weekend, and for them to throw up a big goose egg was something that was not going to be tolerable. You mentioned Quay Russaw, you mentioned James Smith, two guys in state that I think they absolutely have made a priority and need to have. That's going to be even more difficult now, especially with this result. I think recruiting was already difficult enough for Bryan Harsin, given the situation that he had been put in. Now you take into consideration that the AD that hired him, his contract has expired, not renewed. So Auburn in a state of flux right now. Drew, we go through the schedule for Auburn after that Missouri game in October. You look at those games, starting with the first one, LSU at home, then on the road against Georgia, on the road against Ole Miss, and then you got Sam Pittman and Arkansas coming to town. I think he might be done by the end of October. I don't think he's going to make it out of the season. I think it's just a matter of time when that happens. I would not be surprised if he's done by the end of October.
Oh, I agree with you. And the other thing, Auburn's schedule is so unique. They open up with 5 straight home games. And, you know, coming into that game against Auburn, you're talking to all the fans, and they were disappointed about the showing against Mercer. They're disappointed against San Jose State. Then they're trying to talk themselves into how those games are different because there was long rain delays. I do think that played a little factor in it. And then they show up against Penn State. I mean, it's a 3-point spread. Everyone, there's people picking. I know Josh Pate picked Auburn. I think I was on Auburn early in the week, and then they fall apart. I mean, do you have 2 quarterbacks? You don't have 1 quarterback. Isn't that the old saying? I mean, the strength of Auburn's team was supposed to be that run game in the offensive line. Tank Bigsby didn't get a carry in the second half. That offensive line, they gave up 6 sacks. On the flip side, Auburn's front 7 didn't have 1 sack against a Sean Clifford, who is a bit steady at times in the pocket. So I think this is super alarming. We'll see what happens with recruiting. Cooper, you mentioned Quay Russaw, James Smith. Yeah, they'd be great additions. I think Jelani Thurman, the top 247 tight end out of Georgia that's committed to Ohio State, he's a potential X factor on the offensive side of the ball. That's what Bryan Harsin and his staff need to find. Not these guys where it's, I don't know where he is. Is he a DB? Is he a wide receiver? They got to find some talent on the offensive side of the ball. Regardless of whoever is there, I think in 2023, the big thing is going to be talent via the transfer portal. And Cooper, I don't know if you want to get into coaches real quick and potential guys to hire, but one name that jumps out to me, the man that wears the sweaters that says transfer to the SIP. I think Lane Kiffin. We talk about the transfer portal. That's what Auburn needs. Someone like him that's not afraid to push it to the limits and get some real players in there.
Well, who's at the top? Who's making the decisions for Auburn? I think that's what we need to know. I mean, the last couple of years, you look at the AD, he's out already. He hired Bryan Harsin. Before that, Kevin Steele was in the mix. So that to me, I think is what Auburn needs to get figured out. That starts from the tippy top in the plane, starting with the president of that university, who's going to be running that department. It needs to give it some structure. There's a lot of people with a lot of deep pockets at Auburn that want to be involved in this. And I think that more than anything is what you got to get straight first. But I expect Auburn to kind of go back after a Bryan Harsin hire from the Mountain West Conference, a guy that really wasn't known as a recruiter. We've kind of see how that's played out. So I'd expect them to go back to a coach that's had success, proven success in the SEC. And to me, this kind of reeks of what you said, Lane Kiffin. And I would not be surprised with everything Auburn has going on in terms of financially, what they're capable of, new facilities on campus. Lane Kiffin may be looking at that as a pivot point. And don't tell me Lane Kiffin isn't petty and wouldn't love that matchup against Nick Saban head-to-head every single year. I think that's a challenge he'd want to take on. I think that's going to be a guy that's going to get a lot of consideration. I also think Hugh Freeze is probably going to be a guy. Drew, you and me have talked a lot about Dan Lanning potentially. I think it's early for him. I thought that was a big win against BYU. I also think after talking to some people, it's going to be very hard to pluck him out of Eugene contractually. So I don't see that happening right now. But I expect Auburn to kind of go more with the retread within the SEC circles. And if they were going to go with one guy outside of that, Drew, I'm starting to think if Matt Rule doesn't make it past this year with the Carolina Panthers, I mean, he's going to have his pick of options, whether that's Nebraska, Arizona State, or potentially Auburn here. I would love to get your thoughts on that.
No, I agree. And here's my thing. If you're Auburn, who knows when they pull the plug, when he's pulled off life support, when that happens. But get the hire right. Don't race to get someone in that's not a sitting head coach right now, or don't be so focused on a potential retread elsewhere. Get the hire right and then figure out the recruiting. I mean, I if you want to call this 2022 or 2023 class a wash, that's fine. Just make sure the 2024 group is in the right standing. So no, I think Matt Rule is a great hire. someone that can come in and develop, a height, weight, speed, traits type thing. We've heard so much about Auburn changing that recruiting department, thinking more like an NFL model. We'll see if that happens under Harsin, but they need to do that now, in my opinion. Get that two deep right.
I think the concern is a Big Ten team came into Auburn, into your house, and kicked your butt up and down the field and was the more physical team. That should not happen if you're a team in the SEC West who's, especially year in and year out, has the expectations of being a contender in that league. I think that tells you everything you need to know, and I think that's why the writing is on the wall for Bryan Harsin. But, Drew, a lot happening in jam-packed Week 3 college football so far has been delivering on all accounts. I want to get to Week 3 takeaways, and let's start with the number one team in the nation. That is Kirby Smart and the Georgia Bulldogs. A couple different things we wanted to hit on here. You came on this show last week. You've been very adamant that Stetson Bennett, in terms of a Heisman candidate, was kind of your guy that you're riding with, not only because you liked him, but because of the odds. And you look at Stetson Bennett, you look at the talent that he's surrounded by, that offensive line, certainly starting to gel, strong run game. Brock Bowers, man, how about that kid? So special. 3 touchdowns against South Carolina. They win that game 48-7. And right now, looking at Georgia, they don't look like they're playing the same game as everybody else.
No, that defense, I just read this stat, over the past 18 games has allowed 1 first quarter touchdown. I mean, that just comes down to you being a unit and you being so well prepared, which is kind of amazing with Dan Lanning now out. Obviously, Glenn Schumann stepping in and Will Muschamp on that defensive side of the ball. No, I think it starts up front with that defense. I think right now Georgia is probably the best team in college football. And I think Stetson Bennett has been lights out dating back to the college football playoff final last year. And what he has done, 74% as a passer, 952 yards, 5 touchdowns, 3 more rushing. I don't know when Georgia's first real challenge is going to come, but this has been an impressive little stretch for them. And I think as more and more of these youngsters on the defensive side get more live game reps, Malachi Starks, I think it's just going to be even stronger and harder to score against that defense.
Shout out to Malachi Starks, top 247 defender last year and a top 5 ranked player we had as an athlete. We didn't know where he was going to line up. We just knew he was going to be a dynamic dude. Already a couple interceptions to his name. Crazy to see the things that he's doing on the field. Great fit for him in the Georgia Bulldogs. Now, Drew, another game that we highlighted last week was Miami going into College Station, ranked the number 13 team at the time. Aggies coming off a loss to App State. They needed this one. Had some things come out before, a couple guys suspended for curfew reasons. Max Johnson getting his first start. I didn't really know what to expect, but the Aggies grind this out. Really wasn't pretty, but Miami, talking about them and Drew, kind of in the script, we were talking like, to me, my point is Miami very soon here is going to be at a point where talent is not going to be the issue in these type of games. And I thought outside of maybe the receiver position and a couple other spots, that really wasn't the issue. I thought they played Texas A&M pretty well. But game management expectations for Mario Cristobal, which had been an issue dating back to his time in Eugene, I think if you're a Miami fan, that's probably a little bit more cause for concern if you're not as familiar with Cristobal from his time from Oregon. I think this is something that is kind of trickled in now to what we've seen already in an early period with Miami. But Drew, just your thoughts and general takeaways from that game.
Well, I still think Miami needs to find a true wide receiver one. And obviously Xavier Restrepo, he's out a few weeks. I think he had a foot injury. And, Xavier Restrepo is not the most talented wide receiver in that room that Josh Gaddis and Mario Cristobal have. But he's a guy that cares. He's a guy that plays hard. And I think that's why he's become a favorite target for Tyler Van Dyke. To me, when I look at the wide receiver room in Miami, it's just disappointing. Romello Brinson, former top 247 kid out of Miami Northwestern. I know he's been injured, but where is he? Brashard Smith, he was the guy who dropped that pass on the potential 4th down conversion. It didn't even look like he cared out there. So I think Miami needs to find a true wide receiver one, where if you're on the road at Texas A&M, at Clemson, and you need 9 yards, the guy's running the route 11, he's catching it, he's not fumbling, and he's getting you the first down. And I think that's been the issue for Miami over these past few seasons. They really lack that on the offensive side of the ball. Charleston Rambo, Mike Harley last season, I think they bailed out Tyler Van Dyke at some times, but that's the big issue. That's the big struggle right now. And when I look at this commit list for the Hurricanes here in the 2023 cycle, I don't know if they have a guy that can do it. Robbie Washington, Nathaniel Joseph. I think they're nice little toys, nice little guys that can create chunk plays. But do they have a big outside guy that against a top flight corner can create separation? I don't know yet. That's why if I'm going all in like on a Brandon Ennis, a Jurion Dickey, a Hakeem Williams. I'm doing whatever I can to get one of those guys to Coral Gables.
I completely agree, but I also think Miami feels pretty comfortable about getting that done. I mean, where they are regionally, they're put in a better place than most programs in the country in South Florida. They should be able to go out and get a guy like Brandon Ennis, Hakeem Williams, Jurion Dickey, like you mentioned. And Drew, we saw this with the quarterback position. We thought Miami was on the outside looking in. They'd take two quarterbacks. They'd take Emory Williams. But their pursuit of Jaden Rashada really came out of left field. And you can say name, image, and likeness, but that's part of the game nowadays. And listen, if I'm Miami, and I think Mario Cristobal is very adept at this in terms of communicating with the powers that be and saying, this is what I need to get something done. He knows what his priorities are. I can guarantee you he's coming back from this game and saying, hey, we need a game changer at this position. And like you mentioned, Robbie Washington, Nathaniel Joseph, two perfect complements to what Josh Gaddis likes to do in the passing game. Speed and space guy. I think they do need that big body type. That's a physical guy that can take over the game and is a guy that you're going to target on third down. So Hakeem Williams, that's the guy I'm going back to. I know we're going to talk about him a little bit later, but if Miami can get in that race, Brandon Ennis just an alpha dog too, and has extended that this season as well. So Miami's certainly going to be looking for the next guy at the receiver position. But Drew, the Pac-12. How about the Pac-12? I mean, Washington, huge win over the Big Ten in Michigan State and Mel Tucker. I kind of wrote about it in Coop's Corner last Friday, saying Washington can reintroduce themselves on the national stage. They did that. That was a convincing win. That game really wasn't as close as it looked. Michigan State added on some late points in that game. You look at Oregon, the job that they did. They pounced all over BYU. They win that game. Oregon now looking like a team that can make some noise in the Pac-12. And you look at the rest of the Pac-12. Utah, after losing to Florida week 1, is probably more what we thought they were. Oregon State, Washington State, both on undefeated. Can't say enough about the job Jonathan Smith is doing in Oregon State. And then you got USC, Lincoln Riley right now in the top 10. They beat Fresno State in a good Fresno State team with Jake Haener at the quarterback position, 45-17. They, to me, look like a team that is extremely dangerous offensively, getting better week in and week out. Defensively, I mean, the Pac-12, Drew, a lot going on. What were some of your takeaways from what you saw out of that conference this weekend?
Well, I think there's more challengers for USC. You just rattled off all those schools. I know they got Oregon State this week. I'm just excited to see how it all plays out and shakes out. I think if you're a Pac-12 fan, I know some of these schools are leaving, USC's leaving, but you got to feel good about the future of the conference with what Washington's doing. Cooper, you mentioned them in Coop's Corner, and they're 3-0. I wrote them as a recruiting winner this weekend. And, you know, I don't think most fans know that Washington right now has a number 25 recruiting class in the country. And when I look at that recruiting class, I like the fact that they got a top 247 corner out of the state of Louisiana. They got a top 247 pass rusher out of Texas. They got a defensive lineman from Minnesota. They're recruiting a little bit nationally. And I think if they continue to win games, that's only going to get more guys in the boat. 2 2024 commits over the weekend that committed to UW after that game. One kid from Arizona, one kid from Nevada. So I think the trajectory and the arrow is pointing up for Washington. And Coop, I'm always going to say this, Michael Penix, Sunshine State boy, he's balling right now. So I'm all for it. I might need a Washington shirt for my late night game action.
I think Michael Penix, I believe we're gonna have to go back and check this, 8-1 under Kalen DeBoer in total since his time with him as the Indiana offensive coordinator. So Kalen DeBoer, credit to Washington going out, finding that fit with Michael Penix. They've done a great job in the transfer portal. They get a little help at the running back position. They had a transfer from Virginia with some West Coast ties. He's added some stability to that running back room. I think that offensive line room has grown up, and those receivers have always had great potential. It's crazy. I go back from my time at Washington, and I think about those guys and what I thought they could materialize into. Jalen McMillan, Rome Odunze. It's awesome to see those guys getting those opportunities on the defensive end. Credit to those guys. I thought Michigan State was going to challenge them at the line of scrimmage. They were up to the test. And Washington now looking like a dangerous team, now seated within the top 25, I believe, ranked at number 18. And a lot to like around that conference. It's going to be interesting to see who's going to challenge USC for the throne in the Pac-12. But Drew, another guy that we want to talk about, and a guy that got off to a great start. There was some Heisman talk about him in the beginning of the season. They beat Utah, that Pac-12 team we're just talking about. They have a little humbling experience against a really good and top 10 Mark Stoops Kentucky team. And then last week, South Florida comes to town, and it's a mixed bag for Florida and Anthony Richardson as the Gators narrowly escape, win that game 31-28. But right now, Anthony Richardson looks like a quarterback that's pressing a little bit.
Yeah, and it was interesting to see his comments today. I believe he met with the media. I know the guys from Swamp 247 were kind of tweeting a few different things out about Anthony Richardson. And Anthony Richardson came out and admitted there are times when he wants to take off, but he thinks in his head about the quarterback depth situation the Gators currently have. Remember Jack Miller, the transfer from Ohio State? He has still not been cleared to play. So it's really Anthony Richardson, and then behind him are some very, very green guys that weren't highly recruited. Jalen Kitna is one of them. Max Brown from last year, a true freshman out of Oklahoma, former Central Michigan commit. So I think that's messing with his head a little bit. Coop, I went pretty hard on Miami's wide receivers. I also think Florida's wide receivers aren't doing a nice job of helping Anthony Richardson out. But let's be real here. He has struggled back-to-back weeks. USF is not a good team in any way. 2-19, I think, the past few years under Jeff Scott. I mean, that is one of the lowest in FBS. So I think if you're a Florida fan, is there reason to be concerned? Yeah, sure. I will counter back a little bit. I think Billy Napier, his last stop at Louisiana, he always his teams played to the competition they were against. Last year, App State, Troy, Louisiana, they smashed those teams. And then with Northeastern or Southeastern Louisiana, they struggled a little bit. So I think that's interesting about Billy Napier, but they got to figure it out at quarterback. And to me, I think the key is letting him run, get him quarterback runs. Don't be worried about the depth chart situation. Let AR-15 be AR-15. Don't hold him back. I think that's hurting the offense right now.
They're going to go as far as he goes offensively, and he's the heartbeat of that team. I love the way that he's kind of taken this criticism, the way that he's handled it. Big game, College Game Day, heading to Knoxville this weekend. That's going to be a huge game. How about Tennessee, man? I love what they're doing. We'll probably talk a little bit about them. We've talked about the job Josh Heupel has done on the recruiting trail to this point. But that game, I got that circled. Definitely will be watching that this weekend. So we'll keep an eye on Anthony Richardson. But, Drew, let's go to another team in the state of Florida and Tallahassee. How about Mike Norvell? Drew, we talked about it. I called him rudderless this offseason. I didn't know which way Florida State was going. But right now, crazy. I mean, the LSU game was nuts. Duquesne, they beat in week 0. Louisville, they go on the road. And Jordan Travis goes down early in this game. Backup Tade Rodemaker comes in, makes some plays. Johnny Wilson, a fantastic game as well. They squeak out a win on the road against a team that needed a win, with a head coach that needed a win desperately. They win 35-31 against Louisville. And Drew, this is obviously huge for Mike Norvell and Florida State at this point. But in the opposite way of Bryan Harsin, they win their swing game. They beat LSU. They beat Louisville. Now they're at a point, they're at 3-0. And they got a little breathing room. All those offseason rumors have kind of now gone away about Mike Norvell and the hot seat. And now the recruiting fortunes maybe could be turning around a little bit.
Yeah, I wrote in my Florida State was a winner in my winners and losers column. I said Mike Norvell, that warm or hot seat, depending on where you wanted to put it, he put some fire retardant on it. It's completely cool now. I think if you're a Florida State fan, how could you be upset about Mike Norvell? I look at that Louisville game. Jordan Travis goes down. I personally thought Florida State was screwed. I thought they were sunk right there. They rallied behind it. A bunch of unsung heroes, a bunch of program guys making plays down the stretch. And I think that speaks to the culture that Mike Norvell has developed in his time in Tallahassee. And I think Florida State's in position to reap the benefits here on the recruiting trail over the next few days. Blake Nicholson, a top 247 linebacker out of California, he's going to announce a decision Tuesday on the 24/7 Sports YouTube channel. Florida State, the crystal ball leader there. He was at Oregon over the weekend, but still sounds like a lot of people like the Seminoles. They were add him to the boat. That's a monster win. And then the biggest fish out there is Hakeem Williams, who we have talked about at length in the past. He's going to announce Friday afternoon on CBS Sports HQ. Texas A&M is the crystal ball leader, but I had a college coach heavily involved in that recruitment tell me this morning I would not be surprised if FSU is the pick if I was a betting man. So the Seminoles, I said it a few weeks ago on this show, surging in that recruitment. I think a big reason why they are is because they're 3-0. And if Florida State were to add those two, Hakeem and Blake, they'd be up to number 15 in the 2023 recruiting rankings. Hashtag or hat tip to Zach Blosteen of Knowles 247 for that little nugget there. So life is good if you're Mike Norvell right now. It's going to be even better if they can get those two guys in the boat.
Who would have thought? We snuck in a little bit of juice there, but a top 32 player, Hakeem Williams, revisited him this morning. I mean, he is a freak of nature, that frame. He's going to be day one ready, and certainly a guy that's vying for 5-star status. So there you have it, Florida State. If they can pull that off, you're feeling pretty good if you're Mike Norvell. A lot of season left as well, but the Noles looking to capitalize on a 3-0 start. Drew, now our favorite time of the year, and we already have a segment. We're on our way to week 4, but it's crazy. We're talking about it this morning. But the first call segment, which now when jobs are opening up, whether it's Nebraska or Arizona State, and it could be Auburn, it could be Georgia Tech here soon. But our first call segment, I really like this. Arizona State decides that they are going to terminate Herm Edwards after a loss to Eastern Michigan this weekend. It was up and down tenure for Herm Edwards coming back from the NFL. Obviously, a lot of NCAA violations looming over the programs. Antonio Pierce and others out last year. Now it looks like Arizona State is really kind of gearing up for a full reset here, top to bottom. Ray Anderson, the athletic director at Arizona State, his job stability in question as well. But Drew, a couple names that we've been looking at, and you kind of take this from our own Dennis Dodd at CBS Sports. You look at Pete Thamel, the job that he does at ESPN, Bruce Feldman. You kind of splinter this together. A couple of names here: Tom Herman, formerly the coach of Texas; Kalani Sitake at BYU. Obviously, he's had a lot of success against Power 5 teams recently. Bryan Harsin at Auburn. Charles Huff, who we've talked about on this show from Marshall, doing a great job this year. Jamie Chadwell, Coastal Carolina. Dan Mullen taking a year off after a successful, somewhat tenure, obviously tailed off at the end at Florida. And then the last name on that list, Deion Sanders. So, Drew, a couple other guys, Matt Rule, you could throw into contention there. I've heard Jonathan Smith, his name. I don't think he'd leave Oregon State for that. Blake Anderson was another guy, even though they're coming off a tough loss to Weber State. So, Drew, Arizona State, before we kind of get into the names, me and you were talking about this morning, but what type of name do you think a program like Arizona State can attract, and why?
Someone they're going to give a ton of time to, because it's going to be a nice long rebuild. I think it's a 3, 4, 5 year type of rebuild if you want to do this thing the right way. Sure, you can bring a guy in who goes transfer portal heavy, but man, you got to get that scholarship situation right. You got to get the 85 corrected, and you got to figure things out. I mean, essentially, Arizona State is a modern farm team right now, if we want to take a baseball term. I mean, they lost 17 guys to the transfer portal. Jaden Daniels, one of them, obviously the starting quarterback over there at LSU. Johnny Wilson, Cooper, you just mentioned him with Florida State. He had a monster night against Louisville, but man, they got to get it correct. It's going to take some time. So I think someone that comes in with the right vision isn't all that concerned about winning right away. Sure, yeah, if you can make a bowl game year 1, year 2, that's fine. But I think it's a guy that has to have a vision, has to maybe have done this a little bit before, and just realize that it's going to take some time, get some good coaches in there, and most importantly, develop players. I think someone that can develop players is what Arizona State's going to need.
I'm a believer in Arizona State. I'm a believer in Auburn. I'm not a believer in their leadership. I mean, you look at the last couple hires that Arizona State has had, a couple retreads. You look at Herm Edwards, Todd Graham, a guy that they brought in. He's out at Hawaii quickly because of program and cultural issues. Before that, Dennis Erickson, who had some success early in his career at Arizona State. Like when we were at Washington, Arizona State was a tough out. They were kind of the alternative to a down Clay Helton USC team. So I think Arizona State can get back to a place where they're winning 8 to 9 games a year, challenging for the Pac-12. And like you said, you mentioned it, I think talent acquisition has to be at the forefront. I don't think they've had much of a plan. They were really hard to beat when we were at Washington. They were also they were cheating a lot as well. So that might have had something to do with that. But listen, I like Arizona State. I like the upside there. To me, though, like first call, Drew, I'm going to start with you on this one. Who's the first call you're making if you're the AD for Arizona State?
Well, I know you're going to be, because I told you in the pre-production meeting, I was going to say Kenny Dillingham, but after doing some research, writing it down, Kalani Sitake at BYU, I think he fits exactly what we're talking about. He would give them an identity, a big physical presence, and he's been really good as a coach. I think BYU's move to the Big 12 maybe makes this a little bit more difficult if that weren't had to have happened. You look, Arizona State's maybe a step up from BYU. I don't know if that's the case now, but there's no arguing against what Kalani Sitake's done. 23-5 since the start of the 2020 season. He's had 6 guys selected in the NFL draft the past 2 years, and he's recruited that region and recruited that area. So that's the first call I make. I don't think he's going to say yes, so maybe you move on. But Kalani Sitake, first guy I'm reaching out to and just kind of putting some feelers out there for. What about you, Cooper?
Kenny Dillingham already getting some love. I don't know what that guy, maybe he's got a spell out on everybody, but good for him that he's being considered for a head coaching spot in the Pac-12 already. So one big game against BYU, we're throwing his name in the hat. But Drew, I would probably go here Charles Huff. And listen, we talked about Charles Huff. We detailed kind of his resume extensively, working at Alabama, Mississippi State, Penn State with James Franklin. We talked about 24 transfers that he's brought into Marshall. You looked at that Marshall team against Notre Dame. That stage was not too big for him. They looked like the more talented team on the perimeter on both the offense and defensive side of the ball. So I like Charles Huff doing a little bit more deep dive on his background and what he would bring to a place like Arizona State. I think he would have the long-term in mind, not try to microwave that situation. And certainly a guy that I think could win there and attract elite level talent. It would take some time. I think, like you said, he would lean heavily on the transfer portal, but that is going to be a very intriguing coaching hire that we will have our eyes on. Kind of reading up on it this morning. The Arizona State program, how it's viewed perceptionally by coaches across America, is a little bit more favorable than what you would think. So, excuse me, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a surprise hire, maybe of a bigger name than what we expected. But Drew, that is the end of our 4-minute drill. Now moving on to our 2-minute drill. And you wanted to talk about another guy from the Pac-12 that was maybe overlooked in the NFL draft process, not so much in the recruiting process, but he is a guy that has kind of taken the league by storm in year 2. Year 1, he had a great year as well, but that is Amon-Ra St. Brown from USC.
Well, Coop, I talk about this all the time on our recruiting calls. I pound the table for football temperament, guys that want to win, guys that have the will to win. And I think Amon-Ra St. Brown, who went off yesterday, hopefully everyone had him on his fantasy team, on your fantasy team, 8 catches or 9 catches over 150 yards, 2 touchdowns. He's now set an NFL record, or he's the 3rd guy in NFL history where in 8 consecutive games, he's had eight catches or more. I just think that speaks to Amon-Ra. He fell to the 4th round, and I think sometimes we just overthink things. And who's we? Talent evaluators and scouts. I mean, if the kid can play, he's probably going to be able to play. And I think we need to apply that more and more to our rankings process. Brandon Ennis is a kid that's been on the scene forever. We mentioned him earlier with Miami. He's committed to Ohio State. Everyone's concerned about the height, the weight, the speed. And I think when a kid's been on the scene for so long, we nitpick them. I don't overthink it, as would be my message. And I think Amon-Ra St. Brown is proving that with the Detroit Lions after going in the 4th round.
So Drew, kind of a off the wall question right here, but if redraft, right? Knowing what you know now about Amon-Ra St. Brown, obviously you know a lot about his mental makeup, the intangibles of him, and if you don't know anything about Amon-Ra St. Brown, he is an alpha competitor, a guy that works extremely hard at his craft. But Drew, you go back and you kind of look at it. To me, Amon-Ra St. Brown was a guy coming out. You knew exactly what you were getting in terms of the product that you were going to get on Sundays. A super high floor, a guy that was going to be able to impact your offense on day one. I mean, where would you take him if you had to go back and you were part of the NFL front office, knowing what you know now?
I don't think he leaves round 2, right? That's where I think you would slot him, right? I mean, I don't know if he's a 1st round guy, but I think definitely by the end of round 2, he's going somewhere.
I agree completely. And I wanted to make that contrast because there's been a lot of similar conversations surrounding Brandon Ennis, a guy that maybe the physical traits aren't top 32 traits, but in terms of what we've seen of the player, the intangibles, the mentality, those are all type of day one type of traits that we've seen with Brandon Ennis, and a guy that certainly continues to impress. So we'll see how that one plays out over the years with Brandon Ennis, but Amon-Ra St. Brown killing it for the Detroit Lions. Drew, I'm going to go with Duke and Kansas. I mean, whoever would have thought you would think we're talking about college basketball right now in the Final Four, but both of these teams 3-0. Credit to Coach Leopold and Mike Elko at Duke with the job that they've done. Looking at this right now, Duke started 4-0 3 times from 2014 to 2018, so it's not really unfamiliar territory for them. In each of those years, they went on to make a bowl appearance and had winning seasons. Kansas 3-0 for the first time since 2009, 48-plus points scored in all 3 games this season, 28-plus points in all games. Jalen Daniels has been the starter. He is 4-2 over 6 games in the games that he has started in for Kansas. So, I mean, give it up to Kansas, man. Like that game, I think everybody had that circled this weekend at Houston, 9.5-point dogs. They had the weather delay. They go in, they win that game outright impressively. I mean, Kansas might be a legitimate factor in the Big 12, Drew. But, Drew, that's all I got, my man. Any final thoughts from you?
It was a Duke show. We were big Elko supporters. I wrote them in my winners and losers last week. They can be bowl eligible in like the next 2 weweeks if this thing pans out. No, I love to see it. Love to see the parity in the sports, but that's all I got, Coop. That's all I got.
Drew, I want to catch you by surprise. So when we're on StreamYard, just so you know, typically we don't get fan questions, but right now I can see the comments, so I figure we might as well get to a couple of these. Drew, how does recruiting look for Bama in the state of Florida? Eric D mentions Keon Keeley, Cormani McClain, and Damon Wilson.
Well, I think Florida struggling is going to maybe potentially hurt them with Cormani McClain. You know, he was there week 1 against Utah. I think that kind of opened some eyes for him. Just kind of reading that situation, I've always felt like Cormani's looking for a reason to go to Florida. So I think if you're an Alabama fan, you are actively rooting against what Billy Napier and them are doing on the field. I think it's interesting that Keon Keeley could return to Ohio State for an unofficial visit. I still like Alabama there. Keeley recently told me, it was actually last week, that he might make a decision in October and November. We know he's taking that official visit the weekend of October 8th. With Damon Wilson, he's kind of the wild card to me. It's hard to get a read of which way he's leaning. It seems like everywhere he visits, those staffs feel very good about them. He was at Ohio State for the official visit. Georgia felt good coming out of that 4-day stay back in June. So we'll see on Damon. But if I had to rank those guys, I would go Keeley, Cormani, and then Damon Wilson for Alabama.
Well, there you have it from Andrew Ivins, your Florida insider. Also from Andrew Gilmore. Can you comment on Notre Dame? They look pretty bad against Cal. Listen, I wrote about Notre Dame last week, and to me, it doesn't matter how you get it done. Just get it done. Drew Pine in there, obviously a guy they relied heavily on the run game. They're going to need him to make some more plays against North Carolina this week. But if you're Marcus Freeman, just find a way to get in the win column. Notre Dame did that this week. Now he can kind of steady the ship. That's one more week without noise. His team can stay focused, so they got that done. But for Andrew Ivins, I'm Cooper Petagna. We will be back next week to do a little deep dive on the recruiting class of the Penn State Nittany Lions, our MVP team of the week. So we'll do everything A to Z, top to bottom on the Nittany Lions and James Franklin's top 15 class, I believe, right now. But for Andrew Ivins, I'm Cooper Petagna. We will see you on Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern time. Thanks for stopping by.